Forward. In the spring of 1790, a 27-year-old Frenchman, Xavier de Maistre, undertook a journey around his bedroom, later entitling the account of what he had seen, A Journey Around My Room. Gratified by his experiences in 1798, de Maistre undertook a second journey. This time, he traveled by night and ventured out as far as the window ledge, later entitling his account, A Nocturnal Expedition Around My Room. Xavier de Maistre was born in 1763 in the picturesque town of Chambéry at the foot of the French Alps. He was of an intense romantic nature, was fond of reading, especially Montaigne, Pascal, and Rousseau, and of paintings, especially Dutch and French domestic scenes. At the age of 23, de Maistre became fascinated by aeronautics. Etienne Montgolfier had 3 years before achieved international renown by constructing a balloon that flew for 8 minutes above the royal palace of Versailles, bearing as passengers a sheep called Montichiel, quote, climb to the sky, end of quote, a duck, and a rooster. De Maistre and a friend constructed a pair of giant wings out of paper and wire and planned to fly to America. They did not succeed. 2 years later, de Maistre secured himself a place in a hot air balloon and spent a few moments floating above Chambéry before the machine crashed into a pine forest. Then in 1790, while he was living in a modest room at the top of an apartment building in Turin, de Maistre pioneered a mode of travel that was to make his name: room travel. Introducing A Journey Around My Room, Xavier's brother, the political theorist Joseph de Maistre, emphasized that it was not Xavier's intention to cast aspersions on the heroic deeds of the great travelers of the past, Magellan, Drake, Anson, and Cook. Magellan had discovered a western route to the Spice Islands around the southern tip of South America. Drake had circumnavigated the globe. Anson had produced accurate sea charts of the Philippines, and Cook had confirmed the existence of a southern continent. Quote, they were no doubt remarkable men, end of quote, wrote Joseph. It was just that his brother had discovered a way of traveling that might be infinitely more practical for those neither as brave nor as wealthy as they. Quote, thousands of people who, before I came along, had never dared to travel, and others who hadn't been able to, and yet others who'd never even dreamt of traveling, will be emboldened to do so by my example, end of quote, explained Xavier as he prepared for his journey. Quote, would even the most indolent of men hesitate to set off with me to obtain a pleasure that will cost him neither effort nor money? End of quote. He particularly recommended room travel to the poor and to those afraid of storms, robberies, and high cliffs. The story is a giant proverbial shaggy dog. De Maistre locks his door and changes into his dressing gown. Without the need for luggage, he travels to the sofa, the largest piece of furniture in the room. His journey having shaken him from his usual lethargy, he looks at it through fresh eyes and rediscovers some of its qualities. He admires the elegance of its feet and remembers the pleasant hours he has spent cradled in its cushions, dreaming of love and advancement in his career. From his sofa, de Maistre spies his bed. Once again, from a traveler's vantage point, he learns to appreciate this complex piece of furniture. He feels grateful for the nights he has spent in it and takes pride in the aptness of the color of his bed. Quote, I advise any man who can do so to have a pink and white bed, end of quote, he writes, for these are the colors to induce calm and pleasant reveries in the fragile sleeper. De Maistre's work springs from a profound and suggestive insight that the pleasure we derive from journeys is perhaps dependent more on the mindset with which we travel than on the destination we travel to. If only we could apply a traveling mindset to our own locales, we might find these places becoming no less interesting than the high mountain passes and jungles of South America. What then is a traveling mindset? Receptivity might be said to be its chief characteristic. We approach new places with humility. We carry with us no rigid ideas about what is interesting. We irritate locals because we stand in traffic islands and narrow streets and admire what they take to be strange small details. We risk getting run over because we are intrigued by the roof of a government building or an inscription on a wall. We find a supermarket or hairdressers unusually fascinating. We dwell at length on the layout of a menu or the clothes of the presenters on the evening news. We are alive to the layers of history beneath the present and take notes and photographs. Home, on the other hand, finds us more settled in our expectations. We feel assured that we have discovered everything interesting about a neighborhood, primarily by virtue of having lived there a long time. It seems inconceivable that there could be anything new to find in a place which we have been living in for a decade or more. We have become habituated and therefore blind. De Maistre tried to shake us from our passivity. In his second volume of Room Travel, A Nocturnal Expedition Around My Room, he went to his window and looked up at the night sky. Its beauty made him frustrated that such ordinary scenes were not more generally appreciated. Quote, "How few people are now enjoying with me the sublime spectacle that the heavens spread out, in vain, for drowsy men. Those who actually are asleep are one thing, but what would it cost those who are out for a stroll, or those others emerging in crowds from the theater, to look up for a moment and admire the brilliant constellations that are shining down on their heads from every direction?" End of quote. The reason they weren't looking was that they had never done so before. They had fallen into the habit of considering their universe to be boring, and it had dully fallen into line with their expectations. We meet people who have crossed deserts, floated on ice caps, and cut their way through jungles, and yet in whose souls we would search in vain for evidence of what they have witnessed. Wrapped in his dressing gown, satisfied by the confines of his own bedroom, Xavier de Maistre was gently nudging us to try, before taking off for distant hemispheres, to notice what we have already seen. That foreword was by Alain de Botton. And now the introduction. There is a man alone in a room. Maybe he didn't know how he got there and starts to find the whole of his previous existence baffling. His memories of life outside the room tenuous and incoherent. His own sense of self-identity fraught and enigmatic. He could be one of the heroes of Beckett's trilogy. Sometimes the man has been wandering through the wilderness of this world and is lighted in a certain place where he goes to sleep and dreams of the city of destruction and the path that leads from it, through Vanity Fair and past Doubting Castle to the Celestial City. Bunyan's pilgrim. Another man living alone in a room also goes to sleep and sees his hometown of Cambrai, and high society life in Paris, and apple trees on a rainy spring day in Normandy. Proust's narrator, perhaps the real last words of In Search of Lost Time, accidentally omitted in all existing editions, are, quote, "So I awoke, and behold, it was a dream," end of quote. The ideas that visit a man in a room can have momentous implications. On 10th November 1619, a soldier returning to the army of Duke Maximilian of Bavaria from the coronation of Ferdinand II in Frankfurt was detained by the harsh winter weather and took up quarters near Ulm. In a room with a stove, where he found the leisure to think through some of the metaphysical On 10th November 1619, a soldier returning to the army of Duke Maximilian of Bavaria from the coronation of Ferdinand II in Frankfurt was detained by the harsh winter weather and took up quarters near Ulm, in a room with a stove, where he found the leisure to think through some of the metaphysical perplexities that had been preoccupying him. The soldier was Descartes, and the result of his wintry, room-bound ponderings was the Cogito, inaugurating a new epoch in philosophy. Xavier de Maistre's A Journey Around My Room and its successor, A Nocturnal Expedition, are akin to all of these. Like Malloy and Malone and other of Beckett's almost immobilized but unstoppably loquacious protagonists, de Maistre finds that isolation from society and the relative absence of stimuli from the world outside lead him to question his identity, though in a much more relaxed and debonair way than in Beckett, make him reflect on the unstable flux of experience that the practical needs of, quote, ordinary, end of quote, life tend to conceal, and force him to supplement the paucity of events in the room by resorting to memory, imagination, daydream, and storytelling, which sometimes seem to merge into one another. The dimensions of the room vary in accordance with his subjective moods. Sometimes the four walls are a little claustrophobic, but more often the room suddenly turns out to be vast in its dimensions, as if the distance from his armchair to his desk suddenly constituted a huge and almost uncrossable terrain. Shades of Beckett again, and anyone who has ever suffered post-viral fatigue will know just how he feels. Like Bunyan, de Maistre euphemizes his time in the room. Like Bunyan, he was in fact imprisoned there. De Maistre was confined to house arrest for 42 days over a dueling incident. There is little of Bunyan's evangelizing fervor in de Maistre's dreams and visions, and yet in his work too there is a, quote, city of destruction, end of quote, in the background. The Paris of the French Revolution. Xavier de Maistre was the brother of that prince of reactionaries, Joseph de Maistre, whose writings, which Baudelaire, with a degree of irony that is difficult to judge, and possibly without any irony at all, claimed had, quote, taught him how to reason, end of quote, promoted an unflinching papal absolutism, a stubborn monarchism, and a hair-raising cult of the sacramental significance of the death penalty in the specific shape of the executioner, as the only authentic response to the ills of modernity. Xavier was less systematic in his politics than Joseph, but the charm of the journey goes hand in hand with his conviction that Paris had, as a result of the events following 1789, become the capital city of the Antichrist, which he can contemplate with horrified fascination from the relatively safe haven of Turin. And Xavier's apparently desultory meditations not only turn his room, his prison, into the launching pad for some understated but insistent political opinions, quite the opposite of Bunyan's, of course. They also turn the microcosm of his seclusion into a macrocosm that ranges in epic or mock-epic style through time and space, and incidentally, and somewhat unexpectedly, includes some favorable comments on that very unreactionary character, the Satan of Bunyan's contemporary, Milton. Like Proust's narrator, de Maistre finds that enclosure within four walls is a necessary precondition for writing about the life he lived outside them, and like Descartes, he concocts his own, much more whimsical philosophical system. Delightfully brief and refreshingly devoid of metaphysical angst, see chapter 16 of The Expedition. On a rather more sustained note, he indulges in a fanciful reprise of Cartesian dualism, which is given two different variant forms in The Journey and The Nocturnal Expedition. The experience of being alone will naturally tend to lead to an obsession with reflection, indeed in The Journey with mirrors, and with the sense of doubling that is forced on anyone who can think but not act, or is obliged for company to talk to himself. A paradoxical idea. When we talk to ourselves, who is doing the talking and who is doing the listening? But then in all these cases, solitude in a room leads above all to writing, which is almost as odd. Can I write without also reading? What do you write about from inside your room? Both The Journey and The Expedition oscillate between inside and outside, between an examination of the author's immediate environment and speculating about it. Between an examination of the author's immediate environment and speculating about or remembering or anticipating what lies beyond it. An enumeration of the things in one's room can be highly instructive. Nothing is more taken for granted, and yet nothing can say more about who we are than the things with which we have surrounded ourselves. De Maistre, being under house arrest, uses his enforced solitude to contemplate the artifacts and commodities around him, and makes them strange. All that was close, so close as to be almost invisible, becomes far, becomes at times a pretext for imaginative fugues that lead in all sorts of unpredictable directions. De Maistre has had several successors in the art of traveling around your room. Two of the more recent are Daniel Spory and George Perec. Spory's An Anecdoted Topography of Chance is a highly complex text which weaves commentaries of almost Talmudic detail around the objects lying at random, insofar as anything is random, on the table in his room, which thus become the pretext for associations of ideas, chains of memory, stories, and anecdotes, which in turn bristle with footnotes and footnotes on footnotes that mimic such earlier encyclopedic works as the 17th century critical dictionary of Pierre Bayle. It is also faithful to the spirit of de Maistre in its digressions and parenthetical remarks and general indifference to the straight line, which, as Doctor Who and other sages have observed, may be the shortest way of getting from one place to another, but is not necessarily the most interesting. De Maistre pays explicit homage to another great exponent of the squiggle and the diversion and the sudden flight of fancy, also mentioned by Spoeri, the stern both of Tristram Shandy and of that journey which, despite its title, a sentimental journey through France and Italy, characteristically never gets any farther than Lyon. And Perec, too, refuses to indulge in contempt for what is familiar and is happy and sometimes alarmed to find infinite space in a nutshell. His manic attention to the world's visible surfaces, his love of objects, both as things and as the bearers of rich and mysterious meanings, were often brought to bear on his most immediate working environment. In Especies de Espaces, literally types of spaces, he meditates on the page on which he is writing and then moves out successively to the bed, where, among other things, he has spent so much time reading. The bedroom, the apartment, the block, the street, the town, Europe, the world, space. This is reminiscent of de Maistre's flights of cosmic fancy, winging out from the confines of his cell. Though de Maistre has none of Perec's more sociological obsession with classification. How do we define the different spaces in which we live, and how are they related to one another? Perec's pincer, classer, thoughts of sorts, literally thinking, classifying, foregrounds in its very title his more theoretical concerns, and at times restricts itself to an even smaller topography than his room. Like Spoeri, he notes the objects that are on his work table, the lamp, the ashtray, several stones, a lump of lead, etc. Though as he comments, if you're going to make a list, you must try your best to avoid the amnesia and impatience of an etc. And ponders on the possibility of writing the history of some of them, how they came to be there, and what they might say about his habits or his changing tastes. This is similar to de Maistre's cataloging of the paintings on his walls, though again there is a downbeat and ruminative tone to de Maistre, which is quite different from Perec's probing, intense, high-voltage gaze, obsessed with not leaving anything out, not forgetting a single thing. After all, the history from which Perec emerged, he came from a Jewish family. His father died in the early days of the Second World War. His mother was deported and almost certainly perished in Auschwitz, forced him to cling with grim tenacity to everything, since once you start forgetting a single detail, you are yielding to an amnesia that might swallow up even the most tragic and momentous events, such as the Shoah. And this may put de Maistre's journey and expedition in a slightly different light. It would, of course, be a shame to deprive them of the charm which many readers have quite rightly found in them. But like all those other men in rooms, writing about the things around them and using them as pretext for ever-expanding musings, de Maistre is, after all, in reality, cabined, cribbed, confined. They are all prisoners of time and history as well as place, forced to use their imagination to transcend the claustrophobia. They are all prisoners of time and history as well as of place, forced to use their imagination to transcend the claustrophobia of their condition by turning their gaze to their immediate environment. Are they looking for a key to help them escape? Or are they so resigned to seclusion that they are content merely, as it were, to decorate the walls of their prison cells? The question as posted sets up a false antithesis. Maybe a close and scrupulous attention to the prison cell for the world as a way of escaping it, or a precondition for some change in circumstances that would be tantamount to an escape. But all of these writers make us reflect on the extent to which writing both connects with the world, the outside, and holds it at bay. Can be both social, think of de Maistre's kindness, however hedged about with the ironies of shandy and sentimentalism it may be. And the way he always seems to be addressing someone, and solitary, longing for a reality to which it constantly refers, while at the same time dallying with the idea that its own imaginative musings may ultimately be more satisfactory and perhaps even more real. The journey around your room may be as good as any trip around that highly bigger but equally finite room, the world. De Maistre is glad to leave house arrest at the end of the journey, but already nostalgic too for the paradoxical liberty it gave him, and all too happy to return in the nocturne of the expedition to an exploration of that inner space for the apparent inwardness and retreat of writing, what Eric Heller called, quote, the artist's journey into the interior, end of quote, may paradoxically be a better way of exploring not just the great outdoors, hence the plethora of cultural references in De Maistre's text, but a quite different dimension as well, the great outside. Andrew Brown.